From 1960 to 1971, a vicious serial rapist terrorized an island community off the coast of Normandy, France. His horrific appearance to victims and the fact that he fashioned self-defense mechanisms guaranteed his elusiveness. If it had not been for the alertness of two police officers on a routine shift, the identity of the assailant may never have been discovered.
In November 1957, a young 29-year-old nurse waited at a bus stop in the Montalbán area of Jersey Island. As she stood continually looking at her watch to determine if she would be late for work, suddenly and without warning, a man wearing a grotesque mask and odd outfit adorned with screws overwhelmed the young woman and dragged her into a nearby wood. He sexually assaulted her and injured her to the point of requiring stitches. When asked to remember whether she recalled any details about her assailant, the victim stated the man had a distinct quote-unquote Irish accent. What authorities believed to be an isolated incident would escalate gradually and encompass over 16 years of brutal attacks on both women and children, culminating in the complete surprise in the perpetrator's identity. Jersey Island sits off the southeastern coast of England and is the largest of the Channel Islands close to Normandy, France. It has its own judicial system and as of 1981 is no longer part of the United Kingdom. During World War II, the island had been occupied by the Nazis and was one of the very few areas liberated last by the Allies. Even though the inhabitants exhibited fear and loathing over the occupation, but with the old British quote, stiff upper lip, unquote, mentality, they survived. But never had the citizens of the island experienced such fear as during the reign of, quote, the Beast of Jersey, end quote. On March 20th, 1958, a 20-year-old woman walking home from a bus stop in the parish of Trinity suffered a brutal sexual attack when a man blitz attacked her from behind, dragged her into the nearby woods, and sexually assaulted her. In July of that year, a 31-year-old woman, again walking home from a bus stop, suffered an attack which became the signature of this rapist. This woman had a rope placed around her neck and then dragged into the woods where the attacker had his way with her. In August 1959, the same thing happened to a young woman in the parish of Groville and to a 28-year-old woman from the parish of St. Martin's. This last victim actually fought off the attacker and managed to escape. Investigators realized several recurring themes throughout the various attacks. The descriptions given to authorities by the victims did not vary significantly, and the police realized that one man was responsible for these attacks. In addition to the Irish accent, victims described the assailant as being approximately 40 years old, about 5 feet 6 inches in height, wearing a rope or cord around his waist, and often controlled the victims by placing the cord around their necks and tying the victim's hands with that cord. One distinct characteristic agreed to in the victims' descriptions was that the attacker smelled very, quote-unquote, musty. It was then that the authorities began calling the assailant, quote, the Beast of Jersey, end quote. No further attacks occurred until 1960, and authorities noticed that the attacker began using what they termed, quote, sinister twists to his modus operandi, end quote. The quote-unquote beast began attacking indoors and changed his preference of victims with increased ferocity and frequency of his attacks. On February 14th, 1960, a sleeping 12-year-old boy awoke to a grown man standing over his bed who snuck through the boy's second-floor window. The assailant placed a rope around the young boy's neck, brought him into a nearby, desolate area, and quote-unquote indecently assaulted him. In the following month, a 25-year-old woman was walking to a bus stop in St. Brelade when a man pulled over and offered her a ride. The man driving stated he was on his way to pick up his wife. The young woman accepted the ride and noticed that the driver wore a, quote, cap and duffel coat and gloves, but could not make out his features due to the darkness, end quote. The man subsequently drove to a nearby field where he overpowered the woman by punching her, tied her hands behind her back, then dragged into the field. The attacker threatened to kill the woman if she fought too hard. The man then raped the young woman, placed her back in the car, and drove away. The young woman managed to escape from the vehicle and screamed for help, but her assailant escaped into the night. In March 1960, a 43-year-old mother living in an isolated village in the parish of St. Martin's and her daughter suffered a traumatic event when the mother awoke at approximately 12:30 a.m. by the telephone ringing. She picked up the receiver and heard nothing but a click and then a dial tone. The mother went back to sleep. Approximately an hour later, the woman heard another sound coming from the living room. When the mother went down the stairs to investigate, the lights abruptly went out. She heard someone in the living room moving around. In the pitch-dark room, she felt around for the phone. When she picked up the receiver in order to call the police, she heard a dead phone. Suddenly, a dark figure attacked her and then demanded money. Then, the assailant threatened to kill her, but released the mother when he heard her young daughter walking down the stairs. The mother managed to escape from the assailant's grip and ran to a nearby farmhouse to get help. When she returned to her residence, the mother discovered that her daughter had been brutally assaulted. In April 1960, a 14-year-old girl in La Roche awoke in her bed to find a dark figure standing over her. The girl later stated the figure wore a horrific mask over his face and then took off when the young girl screamed. In July of 1960, an 8-year-old boy was abducted from his bed, indecently assaulted, then returned to his doorstep. The attacks then stopped for the rest of the year. In February 1961, a 12-year-old boy in the Montcachon area suffered an attack in the same manner as the previous incursions. In March of that same year, an 11-year-old boy incurred an attack in the parish of Saint-Sauveur. In April, an 11-year-old girl endured a brutal sexual assault in St. Martin's. The attacker had now operated on this tiny island community for nearly 3 years, and they still possessed no idea as to his identity. At this point, the Jersey police requested assistance from Scotland Yard. One of the members of the murder squad, Detective Superintendent Jack Mannings, appealed to the local population for them to, quote-unquote, turn detective. Detective Superintendent Mannings issued a packet to the local press detailing the crimes and the descriptions given by the victims as to what this fiend looked like. Authorities discerned that the assailant struck only on moonlit nights and early mornings between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. He had an intimate knowledge of the island. Carrying a flashlight, it appeared that he chose his victims very carefully, and he entered their victims' residences through a bedroom window. The assailant used stealth and quickness in executing his crimes in subduing his victims and binding and tying them up to incapacitate them swiftly. In each case, he placed a rope around the victims' necks, brought them to a secluded area near the home, then sexually assaulted them. The masked man often spoke with an quote-unquote Irish accent, and often stated that he dropped his cigarettes and his lighter somewhere during the course of the attacks. Because of the size of the island, investigators thought that the perpetrator could not have gone this long without detection, without alerting a family member or a neighbor. Every possible suspect was investigated on the island, including all those with criminal records who may have matched the physical description. The suspects also sat for interviews, but authorities saw no closer steps to catching, quote-unquote, the beast. As Scotland Yard entered the investigation, it seemed to interrupt the attacks, but not cease them entirely. In April of 1963, a 9-year-old boy was attacked in the St. Savoir parish using the same modus operandi. In November of that year, an 11-year-old boy suffered a brutal attack by the beast. For the rest of 1963, no more attacks occurred. But in July 1964, a 10-year-old girl in Trinity Parish suffered from an attack, followed by another attack in August, where a 16-year-old boy endured the torture and assault of the beast. Then, the attacks ceased and the investigation ground to a halt. The citizens of the island believed they could take a breather from this mysterious and silent perpetrator. But like most attackers with this type of bizarre proclivity, the beast sought a return to the limelight when he allegedly penned a letter to the Jersey police in 1966. The letter stated, in its entirety, "My dear sir, I think that it is just the time to tell you that you are just wasting your time, as every time I have done what I always intended to do, and remember, it will not stop at this, but I will be fair to you and give you a chance. I have never had much out of this life, but I intend to get everything I can now. I have always wanted to do the perfect crime. I have done this, but this time let the moon shine very bright in September, because this time it must be perfect. Not one, but two. I am not a maniac by a long shot, but I like to play with you people. You will hear from me before September, and I will give you all the clues, just to see if you can catch me. Yours, very sincerely, Wait and See." After examining and intense study of serial rapists and murderers throughout history, one can ascertain that this letter was most likely written by the perpetrator of these dastardly crimes as he attacked a 15-year-old girl in Trinity Parish in August 1966, just as the letter stated. This attack followed the MO of the previous attacks, but the assailant added another facet of his execution. The latest victim displayed several scratches that appeared mostly uniform on the torso of the victim. After this attack, the assailant took a long, quote-unquote, cooling-off period before striking again. In August 1970, a 13-year-old boy awoke to a flashlight shining in his face in his home in Vallée-de-Vaux. The mysterious man forced the boy to rise from his bed and took him out of the residence to a barren field not too far from his house. The assailant placed a raincoat on the ground and made the boy remove his pajamas. Thereafter, the perpetrator indecently assaulted the boy. The boy, obviously deeply traumatized, waited until the next morning until he reported the assault to his parents, who, in turn, notified the authorities. The boy mentioned to the investigators that the attacker warned the young boy that if he told anyone about it, quote, "someone will harm your mother and father," end quote. The victim's description of the man matched the previous caricatures. In addition to the scratches that the beast added to his repertoire, this time he wore a mask and had spiked black hair. Authorities then interviewed the most likely suspects who resided on the island, and again came up empty with a suspect. One of the men questioned, Alphonse Le Gastois, later held the strong suspicions of law enforcement that he was, quote-unquote, the beast, but later released him due to a lack of evidence. Gastois moved to L'Écreux, where he crowned himself the island's king. Gastois' cabin burned down soon after his release as a result of arson. He spent 14 years in exile before returning. On July 10, 1971, Jersey police officers John Risborough and Tom McGinn began their night shift in the usual manner and concentrated in the St. Helier area. Other than the fears surrounding the beast, Jersey was a quiet place as far as law enforcement was concerned. But on this particular night, at approximately 11:45 p.m., officers Risborough and McGinn sat at one of the few stoplights when a small car blew through the red light at an extremely high rate of speed. The officers gave pursuit, and chased the runaway vehicle as the driver sideswiped several automobiles, drove on the wrong side of the road, and even jumped several sidewalks along the way. After chasing the vehicle, the driver in the pursuit drove into a tomato field and the vehicle stalled. The driver then sought to escape on foot as officers Risborough and McGinn gave foot chase. Risborough subdued the suspect with a rugby tackle, but the driver struggled intently to get away. Officers Risborough and McGinn finally subdued the suspect and brought him back to police headquarters. When arriving at the police station, officers Risborough and McGinn realized that this was not the normal arrest for reckless driving and attempting to evade police. When they got the suspect into the light of the police station, the two officers noted how the suspect was dressed. The suspect wore a raincoat that smelled very, quote-unquote, musty. Nails protruded from the shoulders and the lapels of his coat. Around each wrist, the officers noted that the suspect had nails sticking out from the cloth, and he wore old trousers tucked into his socks, carpet slippers, and woolen gloves. When police instructed the suspect to empty his pockets, the suspect produced a flashlight with black tape, quote, covering the front to provide only a narrow shaft of light, 2 lengths of sashed cord, a peaked woolen cap, several empty cigarette packets, rolls of adhesive tape, and a wig with spiky black hair, end quote. The last item they removed from the suspect's raincoat confirmed that they did indeed arrest the, quote, beast of Jersey, end quote. A homemade, horrific mask. The man arrested, Edward Paisnel, was from an affluent family and worked as a building contractor and was a native and resident of the island of Jersey. Paisnell was married with a daughter and 2 stepchildren. The only spot on his criminal record stemmed from the German occupation of the island during World War II when he stole food to help out starving families. Paisnell's wife, Joan, met the beast while a manager at a children's home known as Les Préférences when he worked there as a handyman. The children at the home referred to Paisnel as, quote-unquote, Uncle Ted, a man who provided candy to the inmates at the home and dressed as Santa Claus every year to distribute gifts among the children. Paisnel married his wife Joan in 1959, and from most accounts, the marriage had its ups and downs until the birth of their first child. Thereafter, the marriage existed in name only. Also after that birth, Paisnel built a secretive building behind his residence that consisted of an office and a place to sleep. Paisnel began living in the building after its completion. The accused rapist would take nightly sojourns where he engaged in fishing or long walks to nowhere. Joan Paisnel stated their husband's sex drive proved very low, but at the time of his arrest, authorities learned that Edward Paisnel had at least one mistress. When investigators finally sat down to interrogate the suspect, when asked as to why he dressed in such a bizarre fashion, his response proved bizarre as he stated he was on his way to an orgy, and in borrowing the car, he took precautions not to be identified. Paisnel also stated the reason for all the nails and screws in his quote-unquote costume were to prevent someone from using martial arts against him. The suspect steadfastly refused to say anything about the mask, but authorities noticed that he had adhesive tape residue on his face, denoting that he wore the mask sometime on the evening that police apprehended him. After the interrogation, law enforcement officers began a search of Paisnel's house and the building behind it. What they found horrified even the most seasoned investigators. Inside the house itself, investigators discovered a secret room that smelled very musty and contained old clothes, made wigs, homemade masks, and false eyebrows. They also found a camera that had several photos of houses on the film roll after its development. Could these have been future and/or past targets? Investigators also noted an altar that appeared to have been satanic, a virtual library filled with works on the occult and black magic rituals, and a large wooden sword hanging on the wall. After the exposure of the secret room and the other items, the police confirmed that they had the quote-unquote Beast of Jersey. Law enforcement authorities subsequently charged Paisnel with 13 charges, including rape, indecent assault, and sodomy against 6 victims, all but one being a minor. During the course of Paisnel's trial, the court learned of the defendant's obsession with the occult. He even possessed a work about Gilles de Rais, the medieval pedophile and serial killer. Authorities noted that whenever they questioned Paisnel, he gave evasive answers and never provided a motive as to why he turned to the brutality that made him infamous. Often, he spoke of, quote, curses, covens, and hints at black magic involvement, end quote. At no time did either authorities or Paisnel assert an insanity defense, even though his behavior seemed strange and methodical. For instance, the reason he knew where to find children was that he often took photographs of the residences that he planned to victimize and where he could find children. Some of the photos were taken even years before he actually victimized the inhabitants. When he finished his individual crimes, Paisnel dropped different misleading objects to throw the police off his trail, including the cigarette packets. Paisnel never smoked. Additionally, Paisnel perfected the Irish accent to also throw off authorities. The letter written to police was actually identified by his wife as having come from his hand. Paisnel expressed pride in the letter after witnessing the authorities' actions after their receipt of the letter. The mask that Paisnel assembled served 2 purposes. The way the mask fit and the way the end product appeared scared intended victims, and to disguise him effectively. In addition to preventing anyone from using quote-unquote martial arts on him, the nails in the wardrobe was designed to keep someone from grabbing him during the course of his crimes and thus allowing him to escape. Adding more damning evidence to the already growing materials proving his guilt, Paisnel was one of 13 men on the island who refused to give his fingerprints when law enforcement searched in depth for the perpetrator prior to 1971. On November 29, 1971, a jury just deliberated after 38 minutes to find Paisnel guilty on all counts. 2 weeks later, Paisnel stood before the court to receive sentencing. The judge pronounced that Paisnel be confined to a correctional facility for 30 years. In September 1972, Paisnel appealed his conviction, but the court rejected his appeal. Paisnel walked out of Winchester Prison in 1991 after prison officials stated that Paisnel had acted as a model prisoner. Prior to his release, Paisnel married a woman that became his pen pal during his incarceration. After his release, Paisnel returned to Jersey, but only briefly, as residents remembered his crimes and forced him to move to the Isle of Wight.
After Paisnel's death, accusations arose that he may have been involved in despicable child abuse at the home that Joan Paisnel managed, the notorious Hôte de la Garenne. Some reports surfaced that Paisnel roamed the halls with his mask at night, scaring children and possibly trolling for new victims at the La Préférence Children's Home. A witness known only as, quote, Mr. D, end quote, provided evidence that Paisnel crept into the bedroom windows dressed in a raincoat and gloves, and that he used chloroform to drug the children and remove them from their beds and abuse them in his signature fashion. Recently, authorities have disclosed that an investigation took place of the home, but that any mention of Paisnel had not been the focus or the intent of that investigation. In fact, the investigative file stated, quote, no firm evidence to hand in the investigation that Paisnel was responsible for any abuse that falls within the parameters of the investigation, end quote. If the allegations forwarded by Mr. D prove true, then Paisnel may be responsible for a greater number of crimes for which he stood convicted. One thing is certain. The inhabitants of Jersey, who were alive at the time of Paisnel's reign of terror, will certainly never forget the sheer petrification they experienced between 1960 and 1971. Paisnel actually died from a heart attack on the Isle of Wight in 1994. Until next time.